Hi Booktube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. These are the books. Trent, Dalton, Lola in the Mirror. Kaouther, Adimi, a bookshop in Algiers, translated by Chris Andrews. Moieties by Elytron, Frass. The Sound Museum by Poupeh, Missaghi. Lantern Lectures, 3 novellas, short stories by Adimi Jones. Some poetry, Femi, The Wickedest. And finally some non-fiction for my non-fiction November, Olivia Laing, Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency. So I'm going to start with Trent Dalton. This is his 3rd novel. And I'm a fanboy. He tells damn good stories, and as long-time viewers and subscribers know, I'm not necessarily interested in storytelling in novels. I look for other things. But Dalton wins me over every time. His previous novels, his debut, which you may have heard of, is Boy Swallows Universe, and he followed it up with All Our Shimmering Skies. And now we have Lola in the Mirror, which, like the debut, Boy Swallows Universe, is set in the world of Brisbane, in a city riddled by drug abuse and drug use within its middle-class suburbs. Only here it was through the viewpoint of a boy, and here it's through the viewpoint of a girl. And the story opens with a girl with no name who's 17 years old and her mother. And they are not homeless, they pronounce themselves houseless. And they have crisscrossed Australia on the run because the mother has claimed to have stabbed an abusive husband and killed him. And ever since then she's been on the run to keep her out of prison and being separated from her daughter. So they have lived under all sorts of assumed identities, mainly taken from female musicians of the 80s and 90s, so that this girl doesn't know her real name. And the mother has said that when she reaches the age of majority at 18, she will tell her her name and the truth, and at that point she knows her daughter will pull away from her because she will not be able to remain in sort of close relationship with her mother. But a few weeks or months, can't remember exactly, before that 18th birthday, I should say, they're houseless because they live in a van which has no tyres. It's up on sort of bricks, and they live in a scrapyard of other cars and vans where other houseless people live. There's this really sort of strong supportive community, even though there are a lot of sort of social issues such as alcoholism and drugs within their community. It's still a tight community, and both the girl and her mother have supported their meagre sort of economic lifestyle through drug dealing, which is sort of packets of any kind of drug smuggled in cheap knockoff CDs of musicians like Madonna, which are sort of manufactured in Indonesia, and then into the CD cases the drugs are slipped in. And the girl with no name delivers them all round the Brisbane suburbs. Anyway, so before she's reached her 18th birthday, her mother saves a baby whose pram has run into the Brisbane River, which is a sort of polluted brown river, fast flowing. But unfortunately the mother drowns even though the baby is saved. So the girl with no name never has this revelation. The only thing she has is another member of the community gives her a locker key, and she goes to find the locker, and it's her mother's name but not her own. But that's a place to start researching, and when she does, she realises that she's been fed a whole pack of lies, that her mother isn't her mother, that she never stabbed her husband, and the rest of the book is a sort of wonderful search by this girl for who her true identity is, at the same time as she's trying to pull away from drug dealing, and the drug dealers won't let her go. She's in it for life. which, if that's true, is a terrible sin that her mother committed by enrolling her in that life. There are two boys. One is in her community, but is a complete dipsomaniac even at the tender age of 17. And the other is a sort of almost a fantasy figure, but he actually exists, of a middle-class boy in the middle-class suburbs. And both the boys are artists like she is, because the book, every chapter is prefaced by these sketches in pen and ink, made by the girl with no name, and her dream is to become an exhibited artist in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, that one day she will live a life where she can take these ink sketches and turn them into proper paintings. And so each chapter starts with one of those, and then it has these sort of, as if it was in an exhibition, the sort of explanation, the title and the explanation, and obviously how that feeds into the chapter that we're going to get. And both these boys also have artistic sort of leanings. And, you know, when I start with the first 100 pages of this book, the stuff with the mother and living in a car and stuff, I'm not sure about this, but actually he's such a good storyteller, and some of the set pieces are just superb. I mean, first of all, the portrayal of Brisbane is absolutely stunning, of the river, of the bridges, of the homeless, of some of the landmarks within the city where the homeless meet because they're landmarks. It's a stunning portrayal of the city I've never visited, but I have such a vivid picture of it thanks to Dalton's writing. But, you know, it's not just the descriptions of place. It's, you know, I find chase scenes in movies boring as hell, car chases, on-foot chases, because there's very little you can do with them. And the thought of them being done through words only, not with any visuals, is mind-blowing to me. And yet Dalton, some of the set-piece chase scenes in here are just fantastic, totally suck me in. This is why I say he's such a good storyteller. Yeah, I love this. There were, you know, she's an 18-year-old girl. She's been pretty, you know, she hasn't a formal education. She's a bit sort of starved of sort of a reality check sort of mechanism. And there were times when I felt this could have verged into sort of young adult fiction, which it just about skirted. And there were other times where the choreography was just lame-brained. You just thought, well, no, those two people wouldn't coincidentally coexist at that point, which is a sort of almost a Deus Ex Machina, and it's a human Ex Machina. But I forgave it. I overlooked it because I was propulsed, compelled, driven through this story by the bravura of its storytelling. Wonderful stuff, 5 stars. And I'd like more people to read Trent Dalton. Okay, so A Bookshop in Algiers by Algerian author Kaouther Adimi. So this is a beautiful little sort of self-contained book, which is a novel, but it delivers a really good introduction into sort of 19th and 20th century Algerian history, if you're not aware of it. So it's the story of, as it says, a bookshop in Algiers, which was set up by a French colonialist when Algeria was a French colony. And we jump about in time between that period, the period of the Algerian Revolution, when they sought and eventually gained independence from France, and contemporary Algeria, where the country's finances are pretty bankrupt, and the government has sort of said, well, there can be no bookshops and no libraries. We're going to shut them down and sell them to developers, which is the fate of this bookshop that was established under this French colonialist. And that the last guy who ran the bookshop, and by then it wasn't even a bookshop, it was a library. It was a little local lending library for the community. So it wasn't even making any money. And it only had sort of 4 or 5 patrons on a regular basis. So it was a real sort of labour of love of this guy to keep it open. So it was a facility there for the community, even if the community largely ignored it. But he's still around, although he's not working in the bookshop. He's sort of on the streets, sort of keeping a wary eye out for, you know, the time when the bookshop will finally be sort of redeveloped. And the other main character is a guy who's sent over from France to clear this bookshop, and you know he's being paid to do it. He's told that nothing is to be retained; it's all to be thrown out or given away. But increasingly, he gets sucked into the local Algerian community, and you know has interactions with the old bookseller. It's just beautifully done. The French colonialist is the bulk. You know, we get his journal, and that's the bulk of this book. And he moves from just being a bookshop to being a publishing house. You know, Camus, you know, in this book, I don't know if it's based on a real story, Camus hung out there, and other sort of fledgling Algerian writers, both French colonials and, you know, native Algerians. And then eventually this guy moves to Paris to continue his publishing endeavours and to try and get sort of representation in print of Algerian writers. So you get these three time spans, as I say, the colonial, the life of the bookshop and the publishing house in colonial times, what it became as a meeting place for Algerian independence fighters. Of course, you know, the intellectuals always play a role in sort of you know, decolonisation movements, and then the modern day where, you know, it's down on its heels, gone to seed, and there's no money. As I say, very self-contained, very simple, very quiet and precisely done. I really like this. 4.5 stars. And on to Moieties by Elytron Frass. Now, this book was sent to me by the author. He said, would I mind reading it? Would I be interested in reading it? And I'm always interested by the concept of Moieties, which I think comes from the French. It means halves, you know, two things that have been separated have been halved. And indeed, this book is exactly that. So we get sort of right to left print, and then you hit the midway stage. Let's see if I can find the midway stage. I think it's page 46 or 49. Yes, it's 46. And then it goes backwards. It's not the same text. It's not the same story. And then, as you can see, there are all these other things going on. That, you know, there's half words there, so you have to mirror. You know, they form 4 words. So if you do that on, say, page 22, they're directly mirrored, but they don't form whole words because it's simply a mirror of that. So you have to go to the page 22 in the second half. No, I haven't found the right page, but basically what you would have to do is do that to there, and it would complete the words. You might find that annoying, but I really like the structure of this book. There are 3 sort of narratives going on. So the main narrative is a brother seeking his sister in the first half, and he goes to these sort of mythical 7 islands where there are sort of mythical beasts that he has to conquer, a bit like what's his name, the Greek hero. I suppose a bit like Odysseus, but I was thinking the guy who had the poison cloak. Anyway, this is irrelevant. So, you know, he takes on these sort of monstrous women such as the fetishist, the lucent, what were the other ones called? The garrotter was another one. And he has to conquer each of these, the female, you know, sort of spirit of each of these, in order to be reunited with his sister. And I really liked that first half. And then at the bottom here, you have a sort of medical sort of report on every, is it on every page? Yeah, pretty much on every page, where conjoined twins are being split apart. You know, the surgery to split them apart, and then observed for their psychological reaction. So again, this notion of moieties, that, you know, there are 3 different narratives of being split apart and trying to find and reunite with what you have lost, with that half that you have lost. I will say the second half, the main text, I didn't get as much out of. It seemed slightly more diffuse than the tight sort of brother seeking 7, to conquer 7 different female beasts. Whereas I couldn't quite see, the central focus of the second part. Now that might be because I read it, I kept on reading from right to left. So I started on page 46 of the second half and ended up on page 1. So it's quite possible that I read it in the wrong order. But equally, I feel that I was sort of encouraged to read it in whatever order I wanted. I can't remember if it's in the testimonies, where it sort of implied that you could read it in any order. So I did read it in my chosen order. And as I say, I didn't quite get as much out of the second half. I wonder if I went back and reread it from page 1 of the, left to right rather than the right to left, whether it would have a different effect on me. But all in all, I really enjoyed the experience of reading this. I really appreciated the work that had gone into the sort of the mirroring, and, some people would get irritated by having to sort of turn the pages to find the matching half and stuff. But I suspect they're the people who would also get irritated by being pulled out of a text by having to go and look up a word. But, I love that. That's my thing. So I appreciate a book that forces slightly more work than just simply reading, from left to right, page to page, paragraph to the next paragraph. I like books that ask a little more of me. So, I thought this was a really good reading experience. 4.5 stars. Now, on to Sound Museum by Poupeh Missaghi. So her previous book, House Residence Number 1, something like that, last year, was in my top 10 reads of the year. It was fabulous. It was very experimental. This is in the Coffee House Press sort of small series. Last year I read another one in that series. This is a whole different kettle of fish. This is, I have to say, hugely disappointing. There's nothing experimental about it at all. But that isn't the issue. One can forgive that if the meat of the book, still works in itself, and it doesn't. So it's a sort of introduction speech at the unveiling of the new museum in Iran. And it's being and the speech is being made by the person who basically, pushed and designed and made this museum happen, who's a woman, and it's a museum of torture. And it's not a museum of torture as exists around the world, where it's a sort of a beacon to the shamefulness of torture, such as the Chul Slang in Cambodia, such as the Holocaust museums. Lest we forget, we must never forget. It's not born out of shame. Rather, it's born out of pride and power. It's a positive asseveration of the Iranian regime that uses torture, and she herself is a torturer, one of the few female torturers. The problem is that I can't help feeling there's a certain flippancy in the tone. It's not overt, but when you're celebrating torture, it's a difficult thing to pull off, with authenticity, with sincerity. And this woman contradicts herself all the time. And I'll go into some of those contradictions in a minute. So I'm asking myself, is it that she's just so blind she can't see the flaws in her own argument? In which case, it's not very well done. It's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. It's very hard to sort of make the case for torture, and it's so obvious the flaws in her logic that it's just not well done. Or is it that the author, and I think it's quite deliberate, these contradictions, or is it that the author just doesn't see, hasn't realised the ridiculous contradictions? And I don't believe that for one moment. I think she knew what she was doing, but I think it doesn't work. So the first, one of the contradictions is she's an absolute, loyal, staunch supporter of the theocratic Iranian regime. but she's also a feminist, and her whole drive is to sort of raise the status of women in Iran, not necessarily to, so they don't have to go about in hijabs. That's not her interest. Her interest is in the sort of the public space, invisibility, to raise the glass ceiling that, Iranian women can do all the things men do. She's a torturer. She's designed and executed this whole museum as a woman, facing lots of challenges by the men who didn't want her to participate, didn't want her to, build this museum because she was a woman. So there's that contradiction. There's the contradiction of, obviously, Iran is its own state, it goes its own way, it doesn't, pay sort of kowtow to the means and ways of the West and America in particular. And yet there's an awful lot borrowed from the West. There's a lot of the business sort of models that she uses in terms of workforce and labour are drawn from Western capitalist and corporate, manuals. She acknowledges that the Americans in things like Abu Ghraib themselves obviously also torture. I mean, she recognises that with glee because America can't sort of be morally superior when it does exactly the same. But she's very critical of America, and yet she will also say, when people attack Iran for the immorality of torture and totalitarianism, she'll say, well, America does it, and America does it because the violence of torture that lies behind torture lies within all of us, everybody. So on the one hand, she's sort of talking about Iranian exceptionalism, but on the other hand, she's trying to defend their exceptionalism by appealing to, well, everyone in the world is the same. So that doesn't work. And in fact, it goes further, that towards the end, she actually sort of says, this is phase one of this museum. In phase two, we'd like to sort of develop a global accessibility, because it's a museum of sound, and I'll talk about what the sound is in a minute, that she'd like to develop a sort of global accessibility to this museum and its sounds by a business relationship with Stanford University. American, she's always appealing to the collective nature of life in Iran and politics and activity, and yet she has a huge ego that this really is her baby and hers alone. And she says she wants to spread the credit with everyone who made it happen, all her fellow women. But her tone again is really, this is all about her. This is her achievement, the individual struggles she had to overcome sort of male resistance. So there's just one contradiction after another, which means that as a whole, the thing just falls apart, I think. So before I give some specific examples of these contradictions, the other thing is, there are predictable reference points and texts. So Hannah Arendt is there for the banality of evil. We get Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and the notion of that in this case, in the case of this book, that the torture isn't even designed to excavate facts and names and of people opposed to the regime. It's really just, as I say, an asseveration of the power of the government and of the theocracy, that they're not to be messed with. So these are all rather sort of predictable, things you'd expect to see referred to in it, and they're there. Okay, so to some of the specific contradictions. So, one of the justifications of torture and being a torturer herself, if she didn't do it, someone else would do it. You have to earn a living. Well, that is the most feeble sort of justification that I've ever come across. I mean, yes, it does feed into the Arendt banality of evil, that ordinary people doing ordinary jobs became, mass exterminators. But it feeds into it the wrong way round, because here it's saying, I have to do this in order to earn a living, whereas in Nazi Germany, it's people who already had a living doing whatever jobs they were doing who were turned into exterminators. So she's actually got that the wrong way round. She also says, she's a torturer, and she's always justifying, that torturers aren't sort of insane people. you know, again, the sort of banality of evil type of stuff. And she points to the fact that, you know, all the artistic vision she had for building this museum and, you know, the sort of architectural and aesthetic work that she put in to make this dream come true. Yeah, but she's still a torturer. And indeed, the book opens with, you'd be surprised by how educated, how well read many of history's torturers have been. Well, she's just another one. She's sort of said that, you know, as a proud asseveration of the Iranian regime, this is not a museum that looks back to the past of torture. As I said, you know, in shame and sort of, you know, wanting to make reparation. It's looking to the future that this will sustain the Iranian regime, that the Iranian regime will continue to operate in this fashion because by doing so, it crushes its enemies. But in a later part of the book, she admits that all civilizations, all empires, eventually crumble and fall, and no doubt theirs will. So that in that case, it's not a museum of futurity at all. It's a museum that knows that its future will come to an end and will thereby remain looking back as a memorial of the past. Another contradiction, which, you know, she herself offers. And it's sort of limply, again, another limp argument that she has is that this museum will stand as a testimony which will be used as evidence if they're ever brought up before, you know, human rights courts, which is just sort of profoundly misguided logic. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. So this book, ultimately, I thought it was dumb, I'm afraid. The writing is perfectly serviceable. But also, you know, it's 113 pages long, which is not a long book, but in terms of its conceit that this is an introductory speech at the opening of a museum, you know, it took me two and a half hours to read. So they're saying, and yes, Hugo Chavez made 4-hour speeches, we get it, but is this book really saying that this woman is giving a, you know, 2.5 hour speech to an audience before they enter and see this museum? There was one funny bit where, I mean, sort of grimly funny, where she sort of says, you know, we gave a questionnaire to the people we tortured with this museum in mind because we wanted to know what we were going to put in it. So we wanted first-hand sort of, you know, reportage from our customers, our clients, our sort of victims. And then later on, as the book ends with the people, the invited audience, about to go in and experience the museum, they're told that, you know, they're going to fill in a questionnaire on their, you know, on you know, their responses to the museum. I said it was a sound museum because what they've done is recorded the sounds of torture, the silences of being confined to solitary confinement, the ambient noise of the, you know, the everyday things that happen in the prison. It's soundproof, so there's no noises coming from outside. There's no sounds of nature getting into the museum. Getting into the torture chambers. It's merely the sounds contained within the torture chambers. So this is a museum of sound. So yeah, I mean, I was annoyed by this book. Having said that, I will say that it packs a lot in its 113 pages, in the sense of I was arguing with it so much at every step of the way that I actually appreciate that in a book, even if I don't like it. If it engages me to dialogue with it, which this book did, even if I felt I was shooting it down at every point, that has value. That has value. I gave it 3 stars because of that. You know, as a book, it would have been a lower rating, but actually, because it's so engaged my ire, as I say, I always feel there's value in that. And on to Lantern Lecture. So 3 novella-length short stories by Adam Mars Jones. The first 2 were kind of curious in their setting. So the first one was post-war Britain. The aristocratic class have been sort of winnowed by particularly the First World War, but also the Second World War. A lot of them, like the whole country post-Second World War, you know, were economically in strife. Several of them sold their estates, family estates, to the National Trust, the newly established National Trust. So we get the viewpoint of a down-at-heel aristocrat who's sold part of his house, his stately home, to the National Trust. So there's, you know, ordinary people are taking tours of it, and his response to that. It's done with sort of charm and bravura. He's not a totally hateful or cartoonish character. It's well done, but it's not particularly a class of people I'm interested in reading about. I don't feel sorry for aristocrats who, have gone to seed. The second story is similar in that it's about Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen Elizabeth II, although this was written in the 80s, so, you know, when she was in her full pomp. And it has quite a funny sort of storyline that she's bitten by one of her corgis and contracts rabies, which eventually kills her in this story. But again, it's that sort of that high end of sort of class and culture that no one has access to, really. The best bit was when, so she's on tour when the rabies fully breaks out in her, and she has a turn, and it's covered up, of course, and this sort of PR guru has to sort of spin it. So, to the Australians who've witnessed her collapse, but they don't know what's caused it. And that was well done and quite funny. But you see, he's from a different class and much more zoned in on our everyday reactions, because he's a PR guy. He's putting messages out, he's putting spin out, stuff we might read in the papers, see on the TV, news reports. So you can relate to that more. And the Queen dies, and Philip has to take over and stuff. But again, it's set in a world, even though it's done with a certain amount of bravura that one can appreciate, but it's not really a world that I can engage in. And then the third story is a sort of true crime from the 70s. A sort of lone wolf post office robber who was dubbed the Black Panther. Nothing to do with the American Black Panther movement. That was just because he operated at night and wore masks and no one could track him. He was like, sort of seemed to have the grace and movement of a cat, that kind of stuff. But he's eventually caught because of a kidnapping that goes horribly, horribly wrong. And I was aware of the facts of this case and of this guy's career, and I felt that it was a very faithful sort of retelling of his whole story. But what did that add to stuff that I already knew was in the public domain? There were one or two good sort of side pieces about sort of the judge's psychology or what was going on in the courtroom that wasn't directly to do with it. It was sort of, the gazes that people gave other people in the court. I thought parts of those were good, but I just couldn't get with it at all. So this book had actually started off, because of the engaging writing style, it started off the first story. I thought, even though I'm not interested in that class, I could appreciate the story. So it started off sort of around the zone of 4 stars. But gradually, more and more, it sort of went down to sort of, really lack of interest, 2.5 stars. And on to the poetry of Caleb Femi. This is called The Wickedest. This is his second collection. I do have his debut collection to read. I bought them both together. But I read this because it's about the phenomenon of the shebeen, which is the sort of the house party, where it's a controlled guest list, and it's a place for members of immigrant communities to go and dance the night away and drink and drugs and stuff. And it's just brilliantly done. Each poem, and there are pictures as well, each poem is time-stamped through the night of one night of the shebeen. So we get to see the lights, the drugs, the music, of course, the rhythms, the relationships of the key people, including the woman who puts on the shebeen, who's the granddaughter of a man who set up the shebeen originally. And it's just terrifically done. So I gave it 5 stars. And finally, Olivia Laing, Funny Weather, Art in Emergency. So this is a collection of Lang's writings from disparate places. When she was on the editorial team of Freeze, some of her newspaper articles. So it's not a coherent treatise, though there are repeating messages and philosophies which lend credence to the art, art in emergence. It's basically Lang's take on art, what art means to her, but it's not a coherently sort of specially devised essay or set of essays to do that, and it's worth bearing that in mind. So it starts off with our artists' lives, and the first one is on Basquiat. And I found that really disappointing, because the best bits of the essay was when she was physically describing a Basquiat work of art. Nothing that, none of her own input other than how she described these works of art. But then actually, the rest of the artists that she'd chosen, such as Agnes Martin, David Hockney, Robert Rauschenberg, Georgia O'Keeffe, Derek Jarman, there was a consistent sort of thing that linked them all together, which is their approach to time in art and freezing something in a painting, and what that spoke to, legacy and beyond death. All of the artists were taken with that, whether consciously or unconsciously. It's what their art manifested. So actually that got stronger. A later series is called Four Women, and they're again all artists, where she goes into their houses to interview them, and it's interesting seeing the artist at home, but the home is also a studio, and that was absolutely fascinating to see how these four female artists, what their living setup and their working setup was. And in one of them, while she's interviewing the artist is sketching her. So there's a sort of dual reflexivity of each other in that, and that was fascinating. Then there are sort of male artists that she's sort of beholden to, like people like Bowie, see who else, John Berger, John Ashbery, Freddie Mercury. But it's a mixed bag. I mean, I like Olivia Laing, both her fiction and her non-fiction. She's always worth reading. And some of the essays, as I say, are really, really good, but it didn't make for a coherent whole for me. And just to say that of the 4 prompts for the non-fiction November, this is the second one I completed. The other one was M. John Harrison's anti-memoir. This was for the prompt join, because I see myself as an artist and therefore a member of the artist community worldwide. I have started a third, something like Sounds Broken and Hollow, something like that, which is about environmental sound. That was for the prompt Path, I think. I will finish it, but it's unfortunately it's reverting to my, I don't know what it is, unease with reading non-fiction. I find non-fiction so hard to read. Unlike fiction, I'm a fiction lover. I'm a fiction devotee. I write fiction. They drive me through books, because I'm looking all the time for stylistic things, linguistic things. That's not saying those things can't exist in non-fiction, and indeed in the best non-fiction they do, such as Melinda McCarthy's Photo, Proto, Nitro, which is just brilliant. But when it's people, setting down facts, making an argument and a plea for our environment in this case, which is something, again, a cause I absolutely, stand behind 100%, but it's not driving me through the book. So I'm reading it in small bits. Anyway, that's it for this video. Till next time, thanks very much.